Today, I'm going to be talking about neuroscience and the biological foundations of behavior. So, when most introductory psychology students, when they think about what psychology is, most of them think about the mind and the brain, and that's usually one of the most common things that students are interested in learning about is some of the brain uh, behavior correlates. And so that's what we're going to be discussing in this lecture here. And we're going to start off by talking about the role of genetic inheritance because when we talk about the biology of behavior, we're talking about not only the brain mechanisms, the role of hormones, but also the influence of genetic factors. So, to understand a little bit about how genetics influence our behavior, we have to have some understanding of the genetic code. Specifically, behavioral geneticists, they study the relative effects of genetic and environmental influences on behavior and mental processes. Um, Notice that it's both the study of the influence of genetic and environmental influences because rarely do we ever find a behavior that is purely influenced by environmental or purely influenced by genetic factors. It's usually some combination of both of them. Okay, so it's really a question of to what degree are genetics contributing versus the environment to a given behavior. And in some cases, it appears to be more of a genetic um, aspect influence, and in some cases, it appears to be more environmental. So, like I said, we have to have some basic understanding of how genetics works, and of course, we usually start off by talking about at the beginning of life, at the moment of conception, we get 26 chromosomes from each of our parents, giving us a total of 46. Okay, each of these chromosomes, a full set of our chromosomes, which includes all of our DNA, can be found inside the cell nucleus. Okay, so the cell nucleus can be found in all cells, with the exception of red blood cells. And so inside of this nucleus, that's where we find our chromosomes, and there are individual pieces of chromosomes, very small bits of chromosomes that make up specific genes. And there are thousands of genes that contribute to various behavioral processes. And so that's what, to some extent, behavioral geneticists look at is can we identify specific genes that appear to be contributing to specific behaviors. That's really one of the large goals of behavioral genetics. Um, the way that genes work, you've probably heard of both dominant and recessive genes. This refers to the fact that, well, a gene is considered to be dominant if it is expressed when it's inherited from one parent. Okay, that's the only thing that really determines whether a gene is dominant or recessive. It's considered to be dominant if you inherit it from a parent, and then it will be expressed, regardless of which copy of a gene is received from the other parent. As long as if you receive it from one parent and that gene is expressed, it's considered dominant. Okay, recessive genes, on the other hand, are only expressed if you inherit two of the same genes. Okay, one from each parent, obviously. Now, this is a good example of this is seen in how we determined eye color and blood type and relatively simple things like that. But when it comes to behavior, most behaviors are determined by many genes, okay? And so these are referred to as polygenic traits. Poly meaning many, genetic, many genes influencing. So these are traits that are controlled by multiple genes and are often, again, affected by environmental and social factors. That is, some genes will be inactive and some will be active, and part of the reason that these genes will become activated has to do with certain environmental exposures. So the methods that psychologists use to study the influence of genes, or heritability, in other words, they have some different methods. One way is to look at twin studies. Okay, so if we look at there are different types of twins. You've heard of identical twins, who are more formally known as monozygotic twins, they share 100% of their genes in common with one another. Fraternal twins, non-identical twins, or dizygotic twins, on the other hand, they share 50% of their genes in common. So, in fact, they're no more related than regular siblings who are born at different times. The only thing that leads us to call them twins is the fact that they're born at the same time. Now, most of the time, twins are raised in the same environment, and so because you have these two different types, and because of the fact that they're born at the same time, that allows researchers to make certain inferences about the genetic contributions to behaviors by looking at the degree of similarity between identical twins and fraternal twins. So if identical twins are more similar on some trait than fraternal twins are, then the assumption is that the reason that they're more similar to one another is because of the fact that they share more genes in common with one another. Okay. On the other hand, if we find that identical twins and fraternal twins are equally similar on a trait, then that suggests that there's more of an environmental influence, because if it were more of a genetic influence, then we would expect there to be a greater similarity in monozygotic twins. Now, keep in mind that this is not a perfect study, in that we can just say that because of the added genetic similarity in monozygotic twins, that can account for the increased similarity, because in fact identical twins are more likely to share similar environments. They're also more likely to be treated similarly. So it's not a simple equation of just, are fraternal twins or identical twins more similar to one another, but again, trying to determine the degree to which these similarities can be accounted for by genetic factors versus environmental ones. There are also studies that are called family studies. Specifically, if a specific trait is inherited, then biological relatives should show increased trait similarity in comparison to unrelated people. So if you think about one of the first questions that you ever get asked when you go to see a doctor, you usually get asked something about your family history. And the reason that your family history is important is because many diseases, in addition to many behaviors, are influenced by genetic traits. And so if there's a family history and you're genetically related to your family members, that is, you're not adopted, then that can be predictive of the likelihood of you exhibiting a particular trait, behavior, or even disease. So again, closer relatives, like siblings for instance, should show more similarity than distant relatives, such as cousins, if genetic factors are in fact contributing more. So as I said, there's a certain assumption there with looking at family members that individuals are not adopted, right? If you're adopted, then chances are you do not share any more genes in common with your family members than random individuals. But we can look to see if adopted children are either more like their biological parents, if and when they can be identified, the biological parents. That's obviously not always going to be the case, but when it is, you are then in a position to compare a child's behavior to their biological parents as well as to their adoptive parents. And once again, if adopted children are more like their biological parents on a behavioral trait, then genetic factors seem to have a greater influence on that trait. If, on the other hand, they're more similar to their adoptive parents, then it seems as if there's more of an environmental influence on that trait. So, as I mentioned, just because we look at these comparisons and we find that individuals with more genetic similarity are more similar, it's not always going to be the case that is due to that genetic similarity. As I said, individuals that share more genes in common may be treated more similarly to one another, and they also might share more similar environments with one another. The other thing is that genetic traits are not fixed or inflexible. As I mentioned, the expression of genes is often determined by lifestyle factors and environmental factors. The other thing is that scientists are able to they attempt to quantify the degree of genetic influence by um, calculating a numerical value, something called a heritability coefficient. And this value can range from 0 to 1, with 0 indicating no genetic influence, 1 indicating about the strongest genetic influence that can be possibly determined. Usually it's not going to be 0 or 1, but it will be somewhere in between those two numbers. And it's important to keep in mind that these heritability estimates, they don't apply to individuals. So that is, just because we can say that 50% of a trait um, can be accounted for by genetic factors, is not to say that 50% of your behavior is determined by genetic factors. That is, the only way we can make these estimates is by looking at large groups of individuals. Anytime we look at large groups of individuals, we don't know about how that applies to any one single individual. We only know that how it applies to a group. So, in fact, genes, environment, and environments, they're often now, also when we look at the biological influences on behavior, and because we're interested in the way that genetic factors influence our environment, we also need to think about the role that evolution has played. So, evolutionary psychology, as you may have read about already, is a subfield of psychology that looks at how the process of natural selection and adaptation has contributed to the expression of behavior, how it can explain what behaviors and mental processes currently exist. So natural selection, I mentioned it briefly in the last lecture, it's the driving mechanism behind evolution. It allows individuals with genetically influenced traits that are adaptive in a particular environment to have a greater likelihood of reproducing. That greater likelihood of reproducing therefore results in more of those particular genes that allowed for that greater reproductive capacity to be passed on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. So, when we think about the genetic influences on behavior, we need to keep in mind, what adaptive value these genes and the resulting behaviors may have had. And so evolutionary psychologists are the ones that study the way that those mechanisms influence behavior. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit at the neural bases of behavior. Neural bases referring to the role of neurons in behavior. So neurons, these are nerve cells that process and transmit information. They're often thought of as the basic building block of the nervous system, and they're responsible for receiving and transmitting information in the form of what are called electrochemical impulses. Now, in addition to neurons, we also have another type of cell in our brain called the glial cell. These are actually cells that provide structural and nutritional and other supportive functions, cleaning up dead and damaged neurons, for instance, providing nourishment, as I mentioned. These are supportive cells, but neurons are really the powerhouse of the nervous system, in the sense that they are the cells that are responsible for transmitting information back and forth with one another. So I mentioned that this information is transmitted in an electrochemical format. So we need to look briefly at what this electrochemical transmission is exactly. Before we can look at that electrochemical transmission, though, it's important to keep in mind that there are different parts of a neuron that are involved in different aspects of this transmission process. So, for instance, we see that over here we've got these structures called dendrites. These are structures, parts of a neuron that primarily receive information. Okay, then we have the cell body here. Okay, this is the nucleus inside of the cell. We talked about before how the DNA is located in there. The cell body, takes that information from the dendrites and passes it down through this structure here, which is called the axon. Okay, the axon is transmits information only in one direction, only in the direction that these arrows are going in. And this is what's ultimately going to carry that electrical signal down the length of the neuron, where it will connect with another neuron at the end down here. So these structures here, these are called terminal buttons. They're at the end of the axon, and it's inside these structures called terminal buttons that you're going to find the chemical part of the message. The chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and that's where the electrochemical transmission signal comes from. Okay, it starts out as an electrical impulse in the cell body that gets carried down the length of the axon. When it reaches the end of the axon, it causes the release of a chemical, hence the name electrochemical. And in order to keep this process moving smoothly and quickly, you'll notice that the axon here is covered by these structures called myelin sheaths. And if you've ever heard of a disease called multiple sclerosis, that's a disease in which these myelin sheaths get attacked and become damaged, and they end up developing scars, and that results in a decreased ability of the neurons to send signals to one another. So if we look inside the axon a little bit more closely, we'll see that the electrical signal occurs because there are different concentrations of molecules called ions. Okay, and these ions are charged particles. Sodium, potassium, and chloride are the main ones, and they can either be positively charged or negatively charged. The outside of the cell tends to have more of a positive potential. The inside of the cell tends to have a more negative potential, and that's what results in something called a membrane potential. And the signal that transfers down the length of the axon occurs because of the movement of ions into and out of the membrane, causing a change in the membrane potential. So what happens is these positively charged ions enter into the axon, negatively charged ions move out, and that's the main process that's responsible for the movement of the signal down the length of the axon. Okay, and this process is referred to as depolarization. Okay, and that occurs because, again, the positively charged ions, they move out of the cell, causing the inside to become actually more negative than it is at rest, that is. So as I mentioned before, when the electrical signal gets down to the end of the axon, inside these terminal buttons here, that's where these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters are stored, and it causes the release of these neurotransmitters. Okay, when they get released, they come into contact with the cell that is closest by, and that cell can receive those chemical messengers, and that's how information is transmitted from one neuron to another. So within a neuron, the signal is largely electrical. Between neurons, the message is largely chemical. So you can see here an electron microscope image of the axons of one neuron connecting with the cell body of another neuron. Okay, that connection is called a synapse, by the way. The synapse refers to this little tiny gap that can be seen under a microscope between the end of one neuron and the beginning of another one. Okay, and it's into that little gap where the neurotransmitters will be released into. Okay, so here's a closer up image of a schematic drawing of the synaptic gap. So you can see the sending neuron releasing the neurotransmitters, the receiving neuron taking those neurotransmitters up by having them bind to what are called receptor sites. Okay, and again, that's what causes that receiving neuron to begin sending on its own electrical signal. The other thing I'll mention about these signals is that the neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers, only have two types of signals. Okay, one is called excitatory, the other is called inhibitory. The inhibitory signal decreases the likelihood of that receiving neuron sending on a message. An excitatory signal, on the other hand, an excitatory neurotransmitter, increases the likelihood of that receiving neuron sending on its signal. Okay, so those are the only two types of signals that these chemical neurotransmitters are capable of sending, but we have to keep in mind that there are actually many neurons connected to one another, and so each individual neurotransmitter is playing a minuscule role. It's really the combination of all the neurotransmitters from all the neurons that are releasing them that results in a significant impact on the receiving neuron. Okay, so we've got some major types of neurotransmitters that you're likely to come across, and that we have begun to understand more and more about. For instance, the first neurotransmitter ever discovered was called acetylcholine. This is a neurotransmitter that is involved in things like muscle contractions, learning and memory, something called rapid eye movement sleep. It's been implicated in other things such as emotion, and it's actually the neurotransmitter system that is targeted by the drugs that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease, and so therefore it's believed to play some role in that disease as well. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that's also involved in movement, but not muscle contraction per se. It's involved in movement at the level of the brain. It's also been implicated in things like attention, memory and learning, emotion. Excessive levels appear to be associated with diseases such as schizophrenia, whereas decreased levels of dopamine appear to be associated with diseases like Parkinson's disease. Okay? Endorphins are another general class of neurotransmitters. These are chemicals that seem to be involved in things like mood and pain. They're actually released in higher amounts during exercise, and so the term runner's high is often attributed to that high sensation that people get when they engage in cardiovascular activity for an extended period of time, is believed to be associated with the release of these endorphins. Okay, another one is called epinephrine. This is a neurotransmitter that's also involved in emotional arousal, memory storage, things like that. GABA, which is an abbreviation, it stands for gamma aminobutyric acid, is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. So I just talked about how neurotransmitters can either be excitatory or inhibitory. This is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in our brain, and it sort of keeps our brain from becoming too overactivated. That is, what do I mean when I say keeps our brain from getting too overactivated? Well, an instance of the brain becoming too overactivated occurs during a seizure. Okay, a seizure is a discharge of activity in the brain that is unregulated, essentially. And so GABA plays a very important role in inhibiting neural activity so that it doesn't get out of control like that. Okay, the other neurotransmitters that you should know about are norepinephrine and serotonin. Once again, these are both believed to be involved in mood. They're both targeted as by antidepressant drugs, and so we'll be talking about those in future lectures as well. Okay, now in addition to the chemical messengers called neurotransmitters, we have other chemical messengers which are called hormones. Okay, and there's a difference between hormones and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters act at the individual cell level. They're released by one cell and received by another cell. Hormones, on the other hand, are released by glands, and they travel through the bloodstream. Okay, so that's a big difference. Some of the major glands in our body include the pineal gland, which is involved in regulating our sleep cycle and what are called circadian rhythms. There's a structure in our brain called the hypothalamus as well that helps to control the pituitary gland, which also influences things like growth and lactation. We have a thyroid gland that's involved in metabolism, also appears to be involved in mood as well because of the fact that individuals with hypothyroidism have a markedly increased likelihood of developing depression. We've got adrenal glands, which are involved in the stress response, and then we've got sex glands, testes and ovaries in men and women respectively, that secrete sex hormones. Okay, and each of those also will have an influence on behavior. So the fact that we have these chemical messengers, these neurotransmitters, that's really what allows drugs as well as poisons to exert their influence on behavior, right? The reason that antidepressants or anxiolytics have their influence on behavior is because of the fact that they're capable of influencing the neurotransmitters because they are capable of binding to similar receptor sites that are found on these cells in our brains. And there are two basic types of drugs. Okay, there are drugs that are called agonists, which mimic neurotransmitters. That is, they're not the same as neurotransmitters, but they are capable of performing a similar function, largely because they have a structural similarity. Antagonist drugs, on the other hand, are drugs that block the activity of a neurotransmitter. So, for example, there are certain drugs that are called dopamine agonists. That means that they increase the signal that dopamine would normally be sending because they're essentially increasing the effect of dopamine as a neurotransmitter. And a dopamine antagonist, on the other hand, would block dopamine receptors so that dopamine could not exert its effect. So I just mentioned a few minutes ago that excessive levels of dopamine are involved in schizophrenia. So the drugs that are largely used to treat schizophrenia block dopamine. On the other hand, I mentioned that low levels of dopamine are associated with Parkinson's disease. So the drugs that are used to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease are dopamine agonists. They're increasing dopamine availability. Okay, now let's take a sort of a broad look at just the general way that the nervous system is organized. Okay, we could separate the nervous system into a central and peripheral component. Okay, we'll be focusing primarily on the central component because it tends to be involved in more complex aspects of behavior, but it's important to know about both of these. Okay, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, all the nerves that come off of the brain and spinal cord are part of what's called the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so take a look at this at this chart, and it'll show you the different components of each of these systems here. As I said, the central nervous system can be broken down into the spinal cord and brain. The peripheral nervous system can also be broken down into what's called a somatic and an autonomic nervous system. Okay, autonomic means self-regulating. Okay, that's an aspect of our nervous system that regulates itself. So you're probably not controlling your respiration rate right now, nor are you controlling your heart rate or how much you're sweating. All those things are being controlled by the autonomic branch of the nervous system. Okay, anything that any aspect of your behavior that you're not in control of is being controlled for you by your autonomic nervous system. Okay, the somatic nervous system, on the other hand, it sends those voluntary signals from your brain to your muscles that allows you to move, and it also sends sensory signals that come in from sensory receptors up to your brain. The autonomic nervous system can also be further broken down once again into a sympathetic and a parasympathetic component. The best way to understand the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system is to think about your fight or flight response. Okay, so when you have a dangerous encounter, you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden you look up, and you see a car coming, okay? And you jump out of the way, and your heart is racing. You start sweating, and your breath is you're breathing very heavily. That is a result of your sympathetic nervous system becoming activated, okay? But a couple minutes later, when you're no longer in danger, your heart rate returns to normal, your breathing slows down, and you stop sweating. Okay, the reason that you go back to your baseline is because of an increase in activity of your parasympathetic nervous system. So these two systems balance each other out. They keep you in a state where you're not over aroused and you're not under aroused. Okay, so these two, although they tend to have opposite functions, they work in concert with one another. Okay, so as I said, the central nervous system, because it's composed of the brain and spinal cord, it's really the branch that makes us as human beings unique, because we have very similar peripheral nervous systems, each to one another, as well as to many other non-human animals. Um, but the central nervous system, it's really what allows us to process information in very complex ways and adapt to our environment in ways that most other non-human animals can. Um, it's also, unfortunately, incredibly fragile. That is, there can be serious damage to neurons in the central nervous system, which is usually permanent. Although not completely, it's much harder for the central nervous system to repair itself after an injury in comparison to the peripheral nervous system. Although it's also important to note that the brain is somewhat plastic, that is, it's malleable, it can be changed. It's not impossible to change the wiring of the central nervous system, but it just does not bounce back the same way as the peripheral nervous system does. So I just mentioned this term called plastic or malleability. Okay, this is a term that's often used, neuroplasticity, specifically to refer to the brain's ability to reorganize and change its structure and function throughout the lifespan. So if you think about it, every bit of learning that you do throughout your life, you're able to accomplish because of changes that are going on inside of your brain. Okay, these might be very minuscule changes at the cellular level, but ultimately, the more your behavior changes, the more your brain is changing, because your brain is ultimately responsible for producing those changes in behavior. Okay, another process that's important in terms of the flexibility of the brain is called neurogenesis. This refers to the division and differentiation of cells to produce new neurons. That is, it was once believed that once we're born with all the neurons that we'll ever have, and that we won't produce any more throughout our entire lives. But we know that that's not true. That there are certain areas of the brain that that do produce new neurons. And another type of cell that also contributes to brain plasticity are stem cells. Okay, these are rare, immature cells that have yet to develop into specialized cells, and so they maintain this capacity to develop into different types of cells because they haven't become specialized yet. So, to summarize, I just got done talking about the peripheral nervous system, and indicated that the peripheral nervous system is the branch of our nervous system that connects to the central nervous system. In other words, it connects the rest of our body to our brain, essentially. The peripheral nervous system, once again, can be broken up into a somatic rather, and an autonomic component. The autonomic can be further broken down into a sympathetic and a parasympathetic component. Okay, so the sympathetic is all those controls all those aspects of behavior that involve arousal, increased energy expenditure, things like pupil dilation, decreases in salivation, acceleration in heart rate, dilation of lungs, digestion and elimination decrease, and increases in sweating. On the other hand, the parasympathetic brings all those things back down to their more baseline level. In other words, it constricts pupils, increases salivation to aid in digestion, slows the heart, constricts the lungs, etc. Okay, now let's take a look at some of these structures in our brain. Okay, first of all, the brain can be divided up into many different ways, but one of the most basic ways to divide it up is into the forebrain, which involves sort of our higher level brain structures, the midbrain, which helps to coordinate things like movement patterns, sleep, and arousal, and then the our hindbrain, which controls our most basic and primitive types of behaviors. Okay, so if we just focus on this picture here, we see that here's the spinal cord. Okay, the first structure that we come upon when we move up the spinal cord is the brainstem. Okay, this is responsible for automatic survival functions like controlling our heartbeat and our respiration, things that we don't have direct control over. Okay, um, so this structure back here is called the cerebellum. It helps us coordinate voluntary movement, balance, and may be involved in some aspects of cognition as well. But this is primarily a structure that helps us keep our balance. So an individual who had an injury to the cerebellum would probably look as if they were intoxicated because they'd have trouble staying upright. Okay, the pons is a structure right here. Pons means bridge. It's sort of a bridge between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. Okay, so there's a lot of pathways that connect between the cerebellum here and the brain because the cerebellum is helping us with our movement, but the cortex up here, the forebrain, is controlling a lot of that movement. So there needs to be communication between this structure here that's helping us coordinate those movements and these structures up here that are helping us to initiate those movements. The pons is also involved in things like respiration, as well as waking, sleep, and appears to be particularly active during dreaming. Okay, so the midbrain is just a very small part of our brain here. As I mentioned, it's really primarily involved in things like coordinating movement and regulating our level of arousal. Okay, one of the ways that we know about the arousal functions of the midbrain is because of some classic studies where electrodes were implanted into the brains of cats, and they found that they could excite those areas of the brain in the cat, and they could put it into an increased state of arousal, or they could stimulate other areas in the midbrain and put it to sleep. Okay. The rest of the structures that are all listed on here are considered to be part of the forebrain. This structure here, a very small structure called the amygdala, is highly involved in the experience of aggression and fear. Once again, we know this from injuries to this area where we see dysregulation of fear and aggressive responses. The hippocampus, located right here, okay, it's a structure that's extremely important in terms of memory. Once again, we can look at individuals that have had injuries to the hippocampus, and we find that they have very disrupted memory systems. That is, they have difficulty learning new information. Okay, this structure here is called the thalamus, and keep in mind that most sensory information is going to be coming up through the spinal cord because we have sensations all over our body, and the pathways that go from all these different sensor receptors located throughout our body, although they end up in areas of the cerebral cortex up here in orange, they pass through this part of the brain right here called the thalamus, and so it's often referred to as the brain's sensory relay station or sensory switchboard, because after it goes through the thalamus here, the thalamus then directs those messages to go to different parts of the brain depending on what the sense is. For example, visual information gets processed over here. Auditory information gets processed. You can't really see it on this picture here, but in an area called the temporal lobe, sensory information gets processed in this area over here called the parietal lobe, etc. Okay, the cortex, that's what we're looking at up here. This is the part of our brain, the part of the forebrain specifically, that is responsible for all the most complex aspects of human behavior, all the things that really make us different from other non-human animals. Another important structure to point out here is this uh, light structure here. It's called the corpus callosum. Corpus means body, callosum means grand, so it's a large body of axons. Okay, remember that axons we talked about are the parts of a neuron that send out that electrical signal. Okay, it's the main message pathway getting from one neuron to another. And so what the corpus callosum does is it's the means by which the left hemisphere of our brain can communicate with the right hemisphere and vice versa. Okay, so these are some structures that we talked about already in the hindbrain, the medulla. This is responsible for, again, autonomic functions like respiration and heartbeat. The pons, we said, was implicated in respiration, movement, waking, sleep, and dreaming. And the cerebellum was involved in coordinating muscle movement, balance, and possibly some aspects of cognition. Okay, the midbrain we talked about as well. The main structure in the midbrain is the reticular formation that helps control our level of arousal, and also is an area of the brain that is responsible for producing large amounts of certain neurotransmitters, in particular dopamine. Once again, this is an area of our brain where there's destruction of this area in Parkinson's disease, that's what results in that decrease in dopamine that we see that produces many of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. The forebrain contains these structures that we looked at already. Once again, the thalamus is it can be thought of at a very basic level as a sensory relay station. The hypothalamus is a structure that governs things like hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. It also controls the production and regulation of certain hormones. The limbic system incorporates some of the structures that are involved in emotion and memory, particularly the hippocampus and the amygdala that I just mentioned. And then the cerebral cortex at the top it's really just the surface layer of our cerebral hemispheres, and is involved in, again, the most complex aspects of our behavior. It's important to note that there are these wrinkles in the cortex, these convolutions, which essentially solve the problem of how to fit more brain tissue into a relatively confined space that is our skull. And so the wrinkles in the cortex, you can picture it like a piece of paper wrinkled up, right? When it's flattened out, it takes up a lot of surface area, but you wrinkle it up, crush it, and it can fit inside of your hand very easily. Okay, so that's essentially what our cortex is doing. It's been folded up upon itself in order to fit more cortical tissue into a confined space. Okay, so once again, limbic system we see composed of hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala. These structures are grouped together in large part because they communicate with one another, and it's no coincidence that many of the memories that we have that are in large part processed through the hippocampus are often emotional types of memories that also are processed by the amygdala. So the amygdala and the hippocampus work together. One is more involved in emotion, one is more involved in memory, but because of the interaction between these two brain structures, that tends to be why we have the best memories for things that had an emotional component. Okay, so the cerebral cortex I mentioned, a very important part of our brains, can be divided up into 4 different lobes. Okay, frontal lobes receive and coordinate messages from other lobes. They control our movement. They allow us to produce speech. and control many of the higher functions. They allow us to organize our behavior, to plan, to respond to feedback, to behave in flexible ways rather than in fixed ways. And these functions are often referred to as executive functions because they're sort of what the executive of the company does. Rather than doing the legwork to run the company, they sort of oversee it, and that's largely what our frontal lobes do. So in particular, one of the important parts of the frontal lobe is the motor cortex here. It controls the voluntary movement. Okay, specifically, we're looking at the left side of the brain here. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And we see some similarities in terms of the way that we process visual information, auditory information, and tactile information as well, in the sense that when information comes in through one side of our body, through, say, the left ear or the left visual field, it gets processed on the opposite side of the brain. That is the right hemisphere if it's coming in through the left visual field or left ear. Okay, the parietal lobe here, okay, in light greenish blue, receives and interprets bodily sensations. The visual cortex in red here is referred to as the occipital lobe. They process visual perception, visual information. The temporal lobes process auditory information, so they're involved in hearing, language comprehension, memory, and emotion. Okay, the memory and emotion come from the fact that the hippocampus and the amygdala, the structures of the limbic system, are located inside the temporal lobe. Okay, in particular, because the temporal lobe is involved in auditory processing, this area of cortex right here has a specific name. It's called the auditory cortex. Okay, it's where information first goes when it comes in through our ears, travels along these nerve pathways. It ends up at the auditory cortex, where we can then identify what that sound is. Okay, if it's a speech sound, it tends to be processed a little bit more posteriorly, right here. This is an area that is involved in the comprehension of speech. It's called the Wernicke's area. Okay, so damage to this area right here will produce a condition called aphasia, which refers to a disruption in the ability to process language. Specifically, individuals with damage to that area will have difficulty understanding both themselves as well as other people. On the other hand, another type of aphasia can be produced by damaging this area here, called Broca's area. Damage to that area results in people having difficulty in the production of speech. Okay, so temporal lobes, we said, contain the auditory cortex as well as Wernicke's area, and they also are involved in memory and emotional control because that's where we can find the hippocampus and amygdala. The occipital lobes process visual information. It's the simplest lobe to recall the function of. There are also areas that are referred to as association areas. These were believed to be what are called quiet areas of the cortex because they don't perform specific functions like visual processing or tactile processing or auditory processing because they sort of integrate information from multiple areas of the brain. And because they don't perform a very specific function relative to just one of the senses, but rather integration of multiple sensory systems, it was difficult for researchers to identify what those areas were actually doing at first. Okay, so I mentioned that there's an area in the back of the frontal lobe called the motor cortex, and we're looking at the left side of the brain here, and we can see that there are different amounts of motor cortex devoted to different parts of our body, and it's no coincidence that there's a larger amount of cortical tissue devoted to areas that have that we have greater motor control over. So if you think about what do we have the greatest control over? Well, our hands, because we need to be able to manipulate things, and our face, in part because we need to form speech, and in part because we need to create different facial expressions that are also very important in communication. Likewise, in the front part of the parietal lobe, we see the motor cortex, which is organized very similarly. That is, the areas that have the greatest sensation take up the greatest proportion of space on the cortex. And finally, one of the last things that I'll talk about is the different functions of the right and the left hemisphere. So our brain is made up of two different hemispheres. The left hemisphere is often associated as being the language hemisphere, because in most individuals, that's the hemisphere of our brain that is dominant for processing language. On the other hand, the right hemisphere tends to be more dominant for processing nonverbal types of information, specifically visual and spatial types of information. So, for instance, knowing your left from your right, knowing which direction is north, south, east, and west, that sort of thing. And one of the some of the really interesting and groundbreaking research that occurred using patients that had undergone a specific procedure called a corpus callosotomy. Okay, this is referred to as split brain patients because literally, if you recall, the corpus callosum is, I said, a bundle of axons that connects the left and right hemisphere of our brain. If you sever those axons, you've then just disconnected the left and right hemisphere of the brain. So this is a really interesting study that can be done with them, again, because the left and right hemispheres are not communicating the way that they normally would. If you show something to an individual in their left visual field, okay, it goes to their right hemisphere. Okay, the right hemisphere in most individuals does not contain language. So if you ask what they saw, they'll report nothing. It's not as if they didn't see anything. It's just that the information went to their right hemisphere. It didn't get to their left hemisphere because it couldn't cross over because there's no corpus callosum here. And so they couldn't verbally report what they saw, despite the fact that they saw something. How do we know this? Well, because the other thing about the wiring of our brain is that, as I mentioned, the right hemisphere of our brain controls the left side of the body. So here, in the middle image, we see the screwdriver is presented to the right hemisphere because it's in the left visual field. So it goes from the left visual field to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is controlling the left side of the body. So if you ask the individual to pick up the tool that they saw on the screen, they can correctly pick up the tool that they saw because the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is what saw the tool on the screen. Okay? Only if you show the individual the object in their right visual field that goes to their left hemisphere will they actually be able to verbally identify what it was that they saw.